Thank you everyone for coming. Yes, there are books outside. They came all the way from Abingdon to sell these books. It just feels like a very long way away. So if you would like to support independent booksellers afterwards, they'll happily sell you books, and I will happily sign the books. But you probably, gosh, and that's one of my books right there in the front. That book is older than you. To be honest, sometimes it feels like that book is older than me. It's a very old book. Yeah, good one though. I like it. So my name's Tim, and I'm a professional nerd. I talk about mathematics and also economics and also statistics. They're all kind of the same. They're all to do with thinking about the world and thinking about numbers. And I talk about them on the radio, sometimes on the television, in books, in newspapers. But the way I like to think of myself at the moment, for just between you and me, is that I'm a truth detective. So what does it mean to be a truth detective? It's simply that the world is full of information. It's full of claims that people make, stories that people tell, numbers that people cite, pictures of numbers, graphs that people draw. And some of those claims, some of those so-called facts are not true. And some of them are true. And my job is kind of to figure out which ones are true and which ones aren't, which is fun, like being a detective. And more recently, I've been trying not just to do that for myself, but to help other people understand what I've learned. Like, how can I help you become a truth detective? But before I explain why, how I think you can do this, how I think we can all do this, I thought it would be a good idea to explain why it might matter. And so I thought I'd start with a story. And the story is about this woman. Does anybody know who this is? You do. Oh, gosh, this is good, yes. Florence Nightingale. Yes, excellent. Good knowledge. This is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale, she looks kind of cross here, doesn't she? She looks kind of cross. I mean, she had quite a lot to be cross about. So Florence Nightingale was working in Scutari Hospital. Scutari Hospital was in a city that we now call Istanbul. And this is 170 years ago. There's a war on, and the British Army is fighting in this war. And British soldiers are coming back from the war, and they're terribly injured. And they go to this hospital. Actually, there were several hospitals in the area. So the Scutari Hospital, the Barracks Hospital. And a lot of them were dying. And Florence Nightingale's job was to be a nurse and also to manage all the other nurses. So she was in charge of all the nurses. And things didn't go that well. So one of the problems was she didn't have the right supplies. So she didn't have vessels to cook food for the soldiers. She didn't have plates to serve the food. She didn't have soap to help the soldiers wash. She didn't have blankets to keep the soldiers warm. So the conditions in the hospital were really bad. So she's trying to look after all these soldiers. A lot of them are dying, and they're dying because the conditions in the hospital are really bad. The hospital's really dirty. And she tries to figure out what's going on. Now today, we would all know that if something's really dirty, if you don't have soap, if there's maybe a dead horse in your water supply, then that's going to cause disease. But people didn't know that 170 years ago. Germs hadn't been discovered yet. They were still arguing over what caused germs and what didn't. So Florence Nightingale didn't have a scientific theory. So what she did instead was to collect numbers. And she collected numbers, and she was particularly interested that so many soldiers were dying of disease in the hospitals until about 1 year into the war. And 1 year into the war, a group of helpers came from the UK, and they helped to clean the hospital. And they found, for example, a dead horse in the water supply. They cleaned that up. They cleaned the walls, they whitewashed the walls. They did a great deal to make the hospitals cleaner. And she noticed that after this, not so many soldiers died. And she thought, maybe this is not a coincidence. Maybe if we clean our hospitals, not so many soldiers die. And she also said, nature is the same everywhere. So something that's true in one place will be true in other places. So if we clean the Scutari hospitals, if we clean the hospitals during this war and fewer soldiers die, maybe if we clean the hospitals back home, fewer people will die. And in fact, maybe if we clean up our cities, have better sewers, don't just use potties, but have proper toilets, maybe fewer people will die. And so she got all the data that she could. All the data is a fancy word for numbers, all the numbers that she could, and she drew what became a very famous picture. And this is a picture of the numbers, and it looks kind of like the world's messiest pizza, or two pizzas, but it's not. This is a graph of something very, very serious. This is a graph of soldiers dying. So each slice of this pizza is a different month of the war. So this is the first year of the war, and this is the second year of the war. And the size of the slices, that's the number of soldiers who are dying. And the colour of the slices is what they're dying of. So you can see usually the orange slices are the smallest. Not always, but it's usually the orange slices that are the smallest. The orange slices, they're soldiers dying of wounds. So they've been shot or they've been stabbed with a bayonet. The blue-grey slices, they're soldiers who've died of disease. And the black slices are soldiers who died for any other reason, like maybe there was an accident. So you can see it's disease that's causing all the problems. But also, this graph is an amazing story. It's not just numbers, it's numbers telling us a story. Because you can see, as the war goes on, more and more and more soldiers are dying. It's really bad. December, January, February, really bad. Then what happens? Halfway through the war, the team from the UK comes and they clean up the hospital. And they clean the horse out of the water supply. And they clean dead dogs and they provide proper food and they do all kinds of useful things. And then after they've come, you can see far fewer people have died. So this is the first reason why numbers can help us be truth detectives. Because if we get all the numbers, we get a much clearer picture of what is happening. But it's not just that the numbers help us understand what's happening. Numbers can also help us persuade other people. You see, Florence Nightingale, when she saw this, remember, Florence Nightingale is angry, and she's angry because all of these men are dying, and she's angry because she realizes it doesn't have to happen. It didn't have to happen, and it doesn't have to happen in future. All you need to do is clean the hospitals. So she starts writing. She writes letter after letter after letter, and she's trying to convince the politicians and the generals and the doctors, clean up the cities, clean up the army barracks, clean up the hospitals. And do they pay any attention? Not really, because this is 170 years ago, and Florence Nightingale is famous, but she's just a woman, and they're all men. And 170 years ago, men didn't want to listen to what women have to say. Unlike now, where men always listen to what women have to say. And so Florence Nightingale said, well, if you're not going to listen to my letters, I'm going to win this argument with my picture. And she sent this picture to the Houses of Parliament. She sent it to kings and queens all across Europe. She sent it to Queen Victoria. She didn't like Queen Victoria. She says, Queen Victoria is the least self-reliant person I have ever known. And she did this big report and she said, I'm going to send it to Queen Victoria. She might look at it because it has pictures. But she understood. I mean, I prefer books with pictures sometimes, which is why my book has pictures in. And she understood that even Queen Victoria prefers pictures. But this is a picture with a message. And she sent this picture to so many people that she won the argument. That slowly but surely the army changed and the senior doctors changed and the laws changed and many, many lives were saved. And that was because, first of all, Florence Nightingale was curious about what was happening. Second, she got the numbers to figure out, is it really true, as I think, is it really true that cleaning up the hospitals helped prevent lives? And third, she used the numbers to tell a story, and that story changed people's minds and saved lives. So that's great. Numbers save lives. But numbers don't always help us. And it seems these days that numbers, they're kind of everywhere. They're not just in your maths textbooks. They're sort of everywhere. If you look online, if you listen to the news, social media, whenever anybody is trying to say anything, trying to persuade you of anything, just numbers absolutely everywhere. And a lot of these numbers, well, they're not very important and they're not necessarily true. They can be really confusing. So here's an example from the book. Okay, does anybody here do spelling tests? Yeah? So there's a famous spelling test in America called the spelling bee. I don't know why it's called a spelling bee. If you know, tell me afterwards. And the winner of the spelling bee, basically all the children in America compete in this spelling test competition until you get to the last few children who are the best spellers in the whole of America. And then you get down to the last two. And then finally, one of them makes a mistake and there's only one child left who is the spelling champion of America. And the question is, what was the length of the word that they were spelling when they won? Okay, so you can see this graph, the orange line, that is the number of letters in the winning word of the spelling competition. The black line, if you're scared of the spiders, I apologize, I am also scared of spiders. The black line is the number of people killed by venomous spider bites in America each year. Does anybody notice anything about these two graphs? Yes. They look the same. There's the same pattern. So they're going up and down, kind of at the same time. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. Suspiciously close. What exactly have these spiders got to do with a spelling competition? Could it be that the spiders are highly competitive and are trying to win the spelling competition? Well, the answer is the spiders have got nothing to do with the spelling competition. This is just a complete coincidence. We call it, if you want the technical term, the long words, it's a spurious correlation. So correlation means, as this girl here was saying, the pattern is the same. Correlation, the pattern is the same. Spurious means it's a load of rubbish. So it comes from a website, the Spurious Correlations website, or the Rubbish Correlations website, if you like. So the thing is, obviously spiders have got nothing to do with the spelling test. Probably. Although if you are learning your spellings, just, keep an eye out. You never know, the spiders can be pretty sneaky. But probably the spiders have got nothing to do with the spelling test. But there are lots of times where you will see, if you're reading a book, if you're looking online, looking at social media, listening to the news, talking to your friends, people will say things, people will make arguments, and they often involve these rubbish patterns, these spurious correlations. Two things that are moving in the same way, that seem to be related, but actually aren't. So, I wrote a book. Did I mention the book is for sale outside? Yeah, yes, excellent. But buy another one, buy two, it's better than one, excellent. So, I wrote this book because you've got all these really, really important numbers out there, like Florence Nightingale's numbers, and then you've got all these really stupid numbers out there, like the spiders and the spelling bees. And it's really hard to know what's true and what's not. And some people, of course, they'll believe anything. That's not what we want. You don't want to believe anything. On the other hand, some people believe nothing. They're always saying, oh, that's not right, I don't believe it. Well, that's not actually any better. It's no good just believing nothing. What you need to do is to be able to figure out what's true and what's not. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I've come up with 3 simple rules to help you be a truth detective. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to explain the 3 simple rules that will help you figure out what's true and what's not. So let's get on with the first rule. And to explain the first rule, I want to tell you another story. Does anybody know what this is a picture of? Yeah. Fairies. Yes. Or is it? Is it? They look like fairies, but are they really fairies? You're looking it up in the book. That's cheating, but fair enough. If you buy a book, then you too will be able to do the same thing. So about 100 years ago, this photograph was published, and a book was written about it called The Coming of the Fairies. And the book said, look, there's these 2 girls from Yorkshire in the north of England, and they've taken 2 photographs of fairies, and then they took later photographs. They've taken these photographs of fairies, and readers of this book will have to decide whether it's just a trick or whether this completely changes our view of what is possible. And the author of The Coming of the Fairies, he believed that we should completely change our view. He believed that the fairies were real, and he believed that this photograph was proof that the fairies were real. Could I just check? Put your hands up if you think the fairies in this photograph are real fairies. Put your hands up if you think the fairies in the photograph are not real fairies. Okay, right. Well, you are right. They are not real fairies. We know they're not real fairies because this little girl, when she was 80, admitted that she'd faked the photographs. When she was 80, and she was a great-grandmother, she's like, all right, I made it all up. But the person who wrote that book, The Coming of the Fairies, he was incredibly famous. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, the most famous detective ever. Sherlock Holmes, who's brilliant, who's never wrong, the ultimate truth detective. The guy who created Sherlock Holmes looked at this and thought, yup, that's fairies. So, well, what's going on? Why was he so easily fooled? Why wasn't he a little bit more logical, like Sherlock Holmes? Well, the problem with Conan Doyle, I think, is that he really wanted to believe in fairies. He really wanted to believe that there was something out there beyond what we could see. He was feeling quite sad. His wife had died, quite young. His mother had died. He was very close to his mother. His oldest son had died in a pandemic after the First World War. So he'd lost lots of people that were important to him. And he wanted to believe that maybe those people weren't completely dead. Maybe he could still talk to them. And if you believe in that kind of thing, well, you can also start to believe in fairies. And here's the thing, when we really want to believe something, we start ignoring kind of obvious facts. So, for example, 100 years ago, if you take a photograph, the camera lens has to stay open for quite a long time. That means you have to stay really still. And that means the only things in photographs, old photographs, that are completely sharp are completely still. Yeah, you can see that this girl, she's not totally still, she's slightly fuzzy. You can see this thing here, this is a waterfall. It's totally blurry because it's moving. Yeah, you don't see like each dot of the waterfall. It's just a blur because the waterfall's moving. Do you notice something about the fairies? Yeah.
They're not at all blurry, they're completely still, so that means they're probably statues.
Absolutely, they're completely still. So maybe they're statues or cutouts, or maybe they were put onto the photograph afterwards, but they're not dancing. They're not dancing, they're not flapping their wings, they're not moving. Now, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle should have known this because he was actually a very good photographer. But what instead he thought is, well, hang on, those fairies are really sharp, they're really clear, so it's a good photograph. That's just nonsense. He's not thinking because he's feeling. He's got this thing that he wants to be true. Another thing Conan Doyle would say is, look at this little girl. How could she fake photographs? I'm a good photographer. I know how difficult it is to fake photographs. It was very difficult 100 years ago, really difficult. You didn't have computer programs that would just put bunny ears on photos or anything. It was very hard to do. And this girl's 9. So how could she do it? How could 2 little girls fake photographs? So the fairies must be true. The thing is, the other girl, whose name is Elsie, she's not that little, is she? No, she's 17. Do you know what she studied? Yeah?
It says in the book that she studied art.
Yeah, and what another example of how if you buy the book, you will already be able to answer all the questions. She studied art. Her art teacher said she used to have these fairy books. She was very good at drawing fairies, copying fairies, and cutting out pictures of fairies. And then after the art school, she got a job. She got a job in a photography studio. And this was just after the First World War. So her job, she would have to take photographs of soldiers, young men who had died in the war. She'd have the photographs of them before the war, and she'd have the photographs of their families. And she'd have to combine the 2 of them together to create a photograph of this young man with his family. Very sad job. It's literally her job to fake photographs. Now, Conan Doyle, he could have figured all this out. If he was in his Sherlock Holmes mode, if he was thinking, what are the other possible explanations? What are the weak points in this story that the fairies are real? He could have seen that, but he didn't. So I call this problem, this is the brain guard problem. So you see here this gentleman with the big boots but the very small brain. He's called the brain guard. And you know, sometimes you see people outside posh restaurants or outside nightclubs, or maybe you see security guards, maybe at the airport, and their job is to figure out who is allowed in and who has to stay out. And the brain guard is like that. The brain guard's job is to figure out what information is allowed into your brain and what information you ignore or you reject or you forget. And we've all got a brain guard because we're just seeing stuff all the time and going, some of the stuff we're paying attention to, some of the stuff we're just like, whatever. Now you would think, you would hope that the brain guard is very good at figuring out, I only want to let true facts into the brain. I don't want nonsense. Only the good stuff should go into my brain. But that's not how it works. See, the brain guard's not very smart. Brain guard is thinking really fast. The brain guard gets very excited, and the brain guard often judges on appearances. So when we're in a hurry, what happens is we just let stuff into our brains because it seems kind of cool, seems interesting, funny, maybe scary. That's the stuff we let in. And stuff that seems kind of boring, we're like, yeah, that doesn't fit. Stuff that challenges what we believe, we don't let that in. Stuff that is closely aligned with what we already believe, the brain guard's like, yeah, come on in. I believe that stuff already. Conan Doyle already believes in fairies. show him a picture of fairies. You're like, yeah, sure, I believe in fairies anyway. Of course it's fairies. So his brain guard was letting in all these bad facts, all these bad ideas, and keeping out the important information, like the little girl who produced the photos of fairies is in fact a 17-year-old who works faking photographs. That's her job. He's like, no, I'm not interested in that fact. I said I was going to give you 3 pieces of advice to be a truth detective. So number 1 is you need to help your brain guard. So how do you help your brain guard? Be calm. Just be calm. Very often when you see information, or you hear something, it's emotionally kind of very exciting. It's scary, or it's funny, or it makes you happy, or it makes you sad. That's why you're hearing it. So if someone tells you something in the playground and it's kind of quite scary, you go and you tell other people. So you tell loads of people a scary thing, or the funny thing, or the sad thing. You tell everyone. Oh, my favourite band are breaking up. Oh, I'm going to tell everyone. And it's the same. It gets on the news because it's scary, or it's funny, or it's sad. So a lot of what we see, the whole reason that we see it, the whole reason that we hear it, is because it's kind of exciting. And so we need to calm down the way that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle didn't calm down in order to think clearly about what's true and what isn't. My favourite, the book, by the way, has truth heroes and truth villains. And one of my favourite truth heroes is Darth Vader. And because Darth Vader says something very important in The Empire Strikes Back. He says, search your feelings. And it's very important when you're looking at information, the first thing you should do is ask yourself, how is this making me feel? If it makes me feel frightened, or it makes me feel excited, or happy, or sad, or any strong feeling, maybe I'm not thinking totally clearly. So just take a little bit of extra time, give your brain guard a bit of extra time, and you might see the information differently. Okay, so that's my first piece of advice, is calm. Now, the second piece of advice is what I call context. Does anybody know what this is? Yeah. Anyone know what this is? Yeah. Oh, some of the mums and dads putting their hands up for Pac-Man. Yeah. So, okay, imagine this. Imagine that you're playing a computer game. And imagine that your mum or your dad or your teacher comes up and says, I just saw in the news that if you play violent computer games, it makes you violent. I think you should stop playing that computer game. Well, now you have a problem. So what do? You say to your mum or your dad or your teacher, you say, we need context for that claim. So you saw in the newspaper that playing a violent computer game makes you violent. So the first thing I want to know is, what did they mean by a violent computer game? Did you ask? Did you pay attention? Did you just have a picture in your mind about what a violent computer game is? Is Pac-Man a violent computer game? Pac-Man eats people. Might be violent. Is Minecraft a violent computer game? Ah, yeah. So my son tells me that that Minecraft is a creative game full of building and exploration. And then I look over his shoulder and he's blowing up a village with TNT. Seems kind of violent. Anyway, the point is not to say, oh, Pac-Man is violent or Minecraft is violent or whatever, but just to say, we've seen this claim, we've seen this news story that your parent has seen or your teacher has seen that says, if you play violent games, it makes you violent. The first thing you have to say is, what do they mean by violent? When they did that research, what did they mean by violent? If you don't know what they meant, were they thinking of space invaders? Were they thinking of, I don't know, Maybe there were even more violent games than Space Invaders. I can't imagine. What were they thinking of? But then there's another thing, like, what do you mean when you say it makes you violent? So maybe what they did is they said, well, look, we looked at all the kids who play violent games and the kids who don't play violent games. And the kids who play violent games, they get into fights. And the kids who don't play violent games, they don't get into fights. So the violent games are making kids get into fights. Maybe. Or maybe it's kids who are already not very nice who like the violent games and who get into fights. It's like, have you ever noticed that the children with the biggest shoes are the ones who are best at maths? It's really true. It's really true. It's totally true. If you doubt me, go to your school, okay, check how big the shoes are of the reception, and then check how big the shoes are of year 5 or year 6. And I bet you'll find year 5 or year 6, they've got bigger shoes, and they're also better at maths. Okay? But it's not because the shoes make you better at maths. Like, you're not going to get better at maths if you go and buy bigger shoes. And by the way, if you study maths, it has many benefits, but it's not going to make your feet bigger. Okay? So it's the same thing here. Like, maybe this is going on. So then maybe, when they looked into this, maybe what they did was they did an experiment. They got some people to play violent games, and some people played just a friendly, happy game. And then afterwards, they said, what we want you to do is take a bottle of hot chili sauce, and you can put it in a milkshake, and we're going to give it to a friend of yours. So this is what some scientists do. It's called the hot sauce paradigm. So you can add a little bit of hot sauce, or none, or loads of hot sauce. By the way, if I was going to give milkshake to a friend of yours, could you put your hands up if you'd put loads of hot sauce in? Okay, could you put your hands up? Okay, hands down. Put your hands up if you would not put a lot of hot sauce. Okay, so I think it's about 2/3 good friends and 1/3 bad friends. Yeah. So the idea here is that people who play violent games, they're more likely to put hot sauce in milkshakes for their friends. Is that a good measure of being violent? I don't know. But the point is, when your parent or your teacher says to you, I saw this news report and they said that playing violent video games makes you violent, that's missing a lot of what we call context. Like, we don't know how they measured being violent. They don't know what their definition was of what a violent game is. We don't know what experiment they ran. We don't know if they even did run an experiment. And so you need to ask questions and get the context, because otherwise, I think your parent better just let you keep on playing the video game. So I said I'd give you 3 pieces of advice to help you be a truth detective. So number 1 was calm. Be calm. Notice how you're feeling when you see a claim, and claim, maybe it's exciting, maybe it's sad, maybe it's frightening. The second piece of advice is get context. All 3 pieces of advice begin with a C, by the way. Be calm, get context. The third piece of advice is be curious. We often think that we know about the world, and we don't necessarily know as much as we think. So, for example, there's this great study where they ask people, how much do you think you know about how a flush lavatory works? On a scale of 1 to 10, like 1 is I don't know anything, and 10 is I know everything. And so people will say, maybe I'm like an 8 out of 10. I think I know how a flush lavatory works. And then you say, great, here's a piece of paper, here's a pencil, draw me a picture, just explain the whole thing to me, please. And then what happens is people sit down and they're like, and then they draw something about a bit like this. It's like, well, there's the poop seat, and there's the I don't know. And then afterwards, they're like, actually, I don't think I was an 8 out of 10. I think maybe I was a 4 out of 10. Because I think if I was an 8 out of 10, probably I would have drawn something like that. The interesting thing is, this is not just true about flush lavatories. This is true about all kinds of things that we believe. So, you know, some grown-ups argue about politics a lot. You notice that? Yeah? Yeah? Between you and me, it's mostly like the flush lavatory. Like, they think they know politics like this, but actually they just know this. But that's okay, because as long as you're arguing, as long as you're just arguing and saying, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right, you never have to sit down and face up to how much you really know. So one really interesting study, they got people to talk about political issues, but instead of saying, oh, tell us who's right, tell us who's wrong, they said, here's a pen and here's a paper, and just explain to us how it all works. And what would happen is people would try and explain, and they didn't really understand, and they realized they didn't understand. And then they started to become a bit more kind of friendly when it came to politics. They'd get into fewer arguments. They'd say, oh, that person who disagrees with me, well, I mean, maybe they have a point. After all, I don't really know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So the point is, we need to realize that none of us know everything. There's always something more to know. It's always worth asking questions. And you can ask questions of yourself, but you can also ask questions of other people. So next time you're in an argument with a friend about something, whatever it is, like, is Minecraft a violent game or not? Who's the best team in the Premier League? Arsenal, obviously. Next time you're in an argument with a friend, instead of just trying to prove that you're right and they're wrong, you could say, oh, tell me more, just explain. Tell me more, just sit and listen. It's really interesting when you sit and listen to people, one of two things happens. One possibility is that they actually don't know anything. And then when you just sit and listen to them, it becomes kind of obvious, even to them, that they don't know what they're talking about. But the other thing is they know loads. And then if you sit and listen, well, then you'll get smarter. So asking questions is really important. Asking questions of yourself, asking questions of other people. And that maybe seems obvious. Like, of course we should ask questions. Of course we should be interested. But we often aren't. There's a really famous story about this guy. Does anybody know what this is? Oh, don't shout out. Yes, it's the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Leaning Tower of Pisa. Yeah, that's it. And there's a famous story, well, loads of famous stories about this guy, Galileo. One story is that he was in an argument about whether if you drop a heavy ball and a light ball, do they fall at the same rate or not? And there are different kind of arguments. But Galileo was like, well, it's okay, we've got this idiot tower that some idiot built that's falling over. Let's just try it. So he tried it, and it turns out they fall at the same rate. So you don't need to argue. You could just ask questions. You could just kind of try and figure it all out. So that's what Galileo did. He's also famous for having one of the first telescopes, and he got into lots of trouble for explaining that, you know, he was pretty sure that the Earth went round the sun and the moon went round the Earth, and other planets also went round the sun, and other planets had moons that went round them. And the Earth isn't complete, the moon isn't a completely smooth, perfectly smooth sphere. It's kind of bumpy and hilly. And this was a problem because a lot of people were like, no, that's wrong. These are evil beliefs. And so he said to people, well, we don't need to argue about this. I've got the telescope. Just look through the telescope and you can see. You can see the bumps on the moon. You can see the moons going around Jupiter. Just look through the telescope. and they wouldn't look. And the reason they wouldn't look is because they thought it was a trick. They thought Galileo was some kind of wizard who would trick them. But we kind of laugh at that sort of idea today. We think, oh, how silly that they wouldn't look through the telescope. But I see that all around me today. So I deal with numbers. I use numbers, like Florence Nightingale used numbers, to try to understand the world and to try to explain the world, and sometimes to try to persuade people what's true and what's not. And what I've noticed is a lot of people don't want to look. Numbers are they're a kind of telescope for the world today. And just like people in Galileo's time who wouldn't look through the telescope, so many people today won't look at the numbers. But hopefully that's not true of you. Hopefully you'll be happy to ask questions of the world. You'll be happy to weigh up the evidence, to try to figure out what's true and what's not. And you'll remember the 3 C's. Be calm, get context, and be curious. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.